This week we're going to start to look at CSS3. So in the next few tutorials we're going to look at some sort of newer web technologies that are not only going to be useful for your mobile web application, for your assignment, but also more generally in terms of web development and future web development and design as well. So the first of these we're looking at is CSS3, which is a proposed specification for some extra functionality to add on to what already exists as CSS2. As usual, W3 Schools is a good resource to get a bit of a background on this stuff, and so I'll be referring to it a little bit. The first thing I want to draw your attention to is this link on the CSS3 W3 Schools website to the CSS3 browser support reference. So if I click on that, what you get is an entire list of proposed CSS styles and their support within the various browsers and various browser versions. So because this is still a developing standard, then there's no browser that completely implements all of the proposals for CSS3. So people are suggesting ideas for things to add, and the various browser vendors have different opinions as to which ones they're going to target first. But ultimately, when this finally does become a standard, there should be cross-browser support for all of these styles. Now, what you'll notice is that if we take any one of these styles over here in the browser support list, you can see that certain browsers, some of them support the style as written, and other ones they require a browser-specific prefix to the CSS style. And the reason that they do that is just so that they can play around with their implementation of that particular style before they finalize it, so that if they change it in the future, then they don't break the code that people have already written. So certain ones of these styles to actually broadly apply some of these styles across all browsers, then you need to actually write the style multiple times with the different browser prefixes for certain styles. And you'll also notice that there's certain styles where only some of the browsers support it and certain styles where none of them yet support it. So this will continue to improve, but that's just something to keep in mind. Now I'm basically going to demonstrate some of the, I guess, the more interesting features of CSS3 in a little bit of an example. So again, feel free to not actually code and follow along as I do it. Feel free to just watch and take notes. But if you do want to do this, all you need is the web browser. You don't need to have it on the server or anything. Okay, so we'll probably refer back to this from time to time to see what syntax we actually have to use. Okay, so this is my example. The font here is a little small, and I have to keep it a bit small so I can have the preview over here on the right as well. But I'll try and zoom in and read out the important things that I'm doing. So I'm going to copy and paste from a partially completed example so that I can go through it reasonably quickly. Okay, so this over here should live update whenever I type something in there. Okay, that's working. Excellent. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to demonstrate is some of the new pseudo selectors that CSS3 allows. So when I'm talking about pseudo selectors, I mean the things like in CSS2 you have pseudo selectors like hover, and it's anywhere where you have a selector and then you use a colon and something else. So something like hover, active, and various other things like that. So they've expanded the pseudo selectors in CSS3, and there might even be a link here to selectors reference. Okay, so this here on CSS3 is again a list of all of the proposed CSS3 pseudo selectors that you might use. So I'm just going to demonstrate a couple of these, but you can always come back here and click on any of these links and find more detail about them. So the example I'm going to use this for is, just copy this bit of HTML. Okay, the example I'm going to use to demonstrate this is a simple case of a table with a bunch of rows. Now, what I want to do is actually style the alternate rows of this table to have different background colors, or just give them different styles. So previously, if you were to do this in CSS2, the only way that you would be able to do it is actually to write into the HTML a different style for alternate rows. So you give every, for example, if you wanted to style the even and odd rows differently, you'd have to put a class of odd on every odd row and a class of even on every even row. So it worked, but it wasn't a very efficient way of doing it. So we have a new pseudo selector in CSS3 now called nth child. Okay, and it essentially allows us to style every whatever we set as n child of a particular element in a certain way. So I've got my style declaration up here. I'd normally recommend that you put your style sheet in an external file, but I'm just going to embed it in the head section here just so that we can see the HTML and the CSS side by side. So the first thing I want to do is just demonstrate a simple case of this nth child pseudo selector. So I've got my table down here with the class of alt row bg, so I can target that with .alt row bg. Okay, and if I want to target the table rows underneath that, then I can put tr. And let's just, to get this working, first of all specify a background color of, let's say, some sort of grey. Okay, so that's how we apply a background color to all of the rows of a table. But I can apply it to just a specific row of the table, and I can do that by using the pseudo selector here, nth child. And this is something that you don't normally see, or we haven't normally used in CSS selectors before CSS3, is you actually can use the parentheses here to then give this pseudo selector a variable. So all we put in here is a number which specifies which of these rows that we want to actually apply this style to. So if we put in a number 1 there, you can see it styles the first row, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Now, some of the other values that we can put in here is to say, we can say apply this to the odd children, so we get rows 1, 3, and 5. And we can also put even, so we get rows 2, 4, and 6. Okay, so we could write two different styles for the odd rows and the even rows, and we could give them different background colors quite easily. That's probably a bit too dark. Okay, so that's a lot easier than having to actually go and edit the HTML and apply an odd and an even class to each row of that table. Because now it doesn't matter how many extra rows we add, the style is still going to apply. Now, just to expand on that slightly, we can also do something like this. So we'll go Alt Row BG TR nth child again. And let's just say I want to color, so we've done the background color, so let's maybe change the text color. So let's say we set the color of the text inside of these table rows as red. Okay, that's going to apply to every one of these. Now let's just say, so we've done odd and even in a particular number. Let's say I want to color the text in every third row red. So what we can do is use the nth child selector, and I can just put 3n. Okay, and so that's essentially saying make every third child of that table, for every table row, make every third one of those apply this particular style. Okay, so we could do the same thing as making every as the even keyword by doing 2n, and we can also do offset. So let's say I want every third one, but I want to actually start it on the first one. So I want 1, 3. I want one to be the first red one, and then every third one after that. So we can put an offset like this. Okay, so -2. So that's essentially saying, okay, do every third one, but start 2 back. Okay, so that's a really flexible way of targeting any sort of numerical pattern of children within an element. So you can use that on anything, not just tables. Any element that's a child of another element, you can use that nth child selector on. Okay, so the next thing we'll look at is opacity. Okay, so I've got here I've got an image of the QUT logo, which I've embedded here, and I've given it a class of faded. So that's what I will use to call my style up here. So .faded. And opacity is something previously, if you wanted an opaque image, you would have to make it as a partially transparent PNG and then use that. But what you can do with CSS3 is just have all of your images completely opaque and control the transparency or the opacity in the CSS. So this is a very simple style. You just write opacity and then you give it a number between 0 and 1. So an opacity of 0 means it's fully transparent. An opacity of 1 means it's fully opaque, and any fraction or any decimal in between there, okay, is going to be partially transparent, partially opaque. Okay, so that one's quite easy. Okay, and the next one will be okay, so staying with this bit of HTML, so notice this heading 2 here on opacity, I have a class of RGBA down here. So opacity you can actually apply to any color now that you apply to any element. So for example, if I want to just create this class here, .rgba. Okay, so we already know how to give a element a particular color. You can do it with a keyword, okay, or you can do a hexadecimal representation. Okay, but the way that we specify a color if we want to include opacity now is to format it like this. So we go RGBA, and again we have these parentheses inside which we give it various different values. So the first three values are going to be your red, green, and blue components, and then the fourth value is going to be your opacity. So a good way to explain this might actually be to open up Photoshop. Okay, and let's just say we take the color picker. So if you've ever looked at the color picker in Photoshop, then you'll see that there's a few different ways that you can define a color. There's the hexadecimal way down here. You can define it in terms of hue, saturation, and brightness, and CMYK, which is the print version, and then this one, which is luminosity and some other things. So in terms of so this value here, so these values essentially all equate to each other. So if we're used to defining colors as hexadecimal values, it's easy enough if you know the hexadecimal value that you want. Let's say I want red, which is FF0000, okay, to come across here and see what the equivalent is in RGB syntax. So these values are always going to range between 0 and 255, 0 meaning there's none of that color, and 255 meaning that color is entirely saturated. So obviously enough, red's going to be full red, and then no green and no blue. So, I mean, I don't really know of anyone who memorizes values for colors anyway, so an easy way to get your colors might just be to come in here and select it with some sort of color picker, and go for some kind of orange. Okay, and then just read off those values. So just to see that this is the same color, we'll use that one in the hexadecimal style of specifying the color. Okay, there it is, our orange. Alright, and then to specify it in terms of RGB, we just use these colors, so 240, 180, and 18. So we can actually define it as just RGB. Okay, and we can see that's the same color, but then this syntax allows us to add an alpha value to that, which is refers to transparency. So if we change this from RGB to RGBA, then we can add a fourth value here between 0 and 1, just like our opacity style, which determines how transparent or opaque that is. So if I go 0.5 there, okay, now it's got that color, but it's 50% opacity. So again, if you just wanted something as simple as partially transparent text in the past, you would have to make that text as an image, and it would break, you know, all the good things about having text as text semantically and for search engine optimization and all that kind of stuff. And the other great thing about this is you can then incorporate this into sort of interactive effects. So you could quite easily create an effect where you slightly change the opacity on a hover, for example, and then you've done that, and all it's taken is a couple of characters of text rather than two separate images. So that saves you a lot of space in the grand scheme of things, especially when you end up having a whole lot of these. And so that's good generally for the web to have smaller file sizes, but particularly for the mobile, where sort of bandwidth and download is at more of a premium, these kind of things are real help there as well. Okay, alright, the next thing I'll talk about is okay, again, something which previously you would likely have had to create images for is to have rounded corners on any elements. And if you've ever made a a fluid width container which has rounded corners on the caps. You know how annoying that is to have to cut it up into divs and put the top and bottom parts on and have the middle part flexible. So now this is something that you can do straight with CSS3. So I've got a div here with two classes. The first class is box and the second class is rounded corners. So I'm going to use this box class a bit just to create a 100 by 100 pixel box here. So I'll create that class. And we'll give it a background color of, what do I choose here? Sort of a medium grey. Okay, so there's my box. I can create as many of those as I want for other examples. And now I'm going to define this style for rounded corners, which will change my box from being 90-degree angle corners to sort of rounded corners. So dot rounded corners. Okay, so the way that we specify rounded corners is by using the border radius. Okay, and this takes a variable number of values. If you give it one value, it will apply it globally to all corners. If you give it two values, so let's make the first one 0, so that's a bit easy to see. Okay, so this sort of operates similarly to when you're defining things like margins and paddings as multiple values. They always operate from top sort of around clockwise. So if you specify a border radius as two values, then the first value gets applied to the top left and the bottom right, and the second value gets applied to the top right and the bottom left. And if we specify for different values, then they're going to get applied from top left in clockwise fashion around to the bottom left. Now you can also specify the border radius in terms of percentages. So a cool thing to do is if you say make the border radius 50%, is what will actually make every radius exactly, it will make the corner radius exactly the radius of the element itself, and so you get what ends up looking like a perfect circle. Okay, so in this case I've got 50% top and bottom and 0% top right, bottom left. Okay, so far we've avoided having to use any browser-specific prefixes, but some of the next stuff we're going to get into will actually have to use that. And what I want to look at next is shadow effects. Again, something that in CSS2 days you would have had to create all of the graphics yourself, cut them up and then apply them and layer them so that you had nice drop shadows. Okay, so that's a much longer process, and it's a lot more annoying to change the style, because if you want to change the dimensions or anything about it, the color, you have to go back to your visual assets, re-edit them in Photoshop, and then save them, upload them, refresh the page. Okay, so I have here I have here an unordered list which has 3 list items, and each list item contains an instance of my box class that I've defined. Now what I'm going to do is just add a couple of styles so that these sit side by side rather than on top of each other. So let's go. So I'll go, I've got my unordered list has a class of horizontal. So let's go list style type none to get rid of those dots, and then I'll go display, oops, inline. Alright. So the list items. Okay, so they're spaced out a bit more nicely now. A little bit more. Okay, that'll do. Okay, alright. Okay, so I'm going to apply some different shadows to these three different divs here. So each div I've got three classes applied to it. I've got the box class and the rounded corners class, and then I've got alternately shadows 2 and shadows 3. So I'll create my .shadows style. Okay, and we'll do a simple shadow style first of all. Now this one does require a browser-specific prefix. So if I was writing this to target all the different browsers, I'd have to duplicate this style with each of the different prefixes. So WebKit for the WebKit browsers, MOZ for Mozilla, I think it's O for Opera, and MS for Internet Explorer. But for the sake of not wasting a whole heap of time, I'll just do the WebKit example for now. So we do WebKit hyphen, what is it, hyphen box shadow. Okay, and you can apply 4 different values. So this first value here is, or the first 2 values represent an offset. So let's set this third one to 0 to start with. Okay. Now, if these are all 0, then you get nothing, because it's essentially telling it to sit the shadow directly behind it. So these values are pretty much akin to, if you're making a drop shadow as a layer style in Photoshop, then you always specify an X offset, a Y offset, and then usually a blur or a spread value. So that's exactly what these values are here. So the first value, you can see if I set that to 10, okay, we get a shadow out here which is offset 10 pixels on the horizontal scale. Make that a little bit less. And if we add, if we put in a value for the second one, say 15, okay, then you can see it's offset 15 pixels. Now these can be negative values as well, so if you want it to be offset the other way, you just change them to negative values. And this third value here is essentially your blurring or your softening value. So the larger you make this number, so if I make that 10, you can see that it's softening by an amount of 10 pixels. So I guess the 10 pixels refers to 10 pixels of distance over which it fades from its full strength to completely transparent. So you can see if I make that really huge, then you end up getting a really, really soft shadow. And if you make it very small, or if you make it 0, you get a completely hard edge. So let's make that 10 pixels again. And then, of course, you have your color here. So I'll set that shadow to black, but you can also, what I forgot to mention before about the RGBA values is anywhere where you normally specify a color for anything, you can specify a color as RGBA. So you can tell this shadow to actually be partially opaque as well. So if you have something behind it which you want to still show through on the shadow, then you can specify an RGBA value for the color of the shadow. So if I want it to be still black, so I'll go 000. So if I make it 0001, it's going to be completely opaque black, and I can make it half strength, so half transparent. So if I had a picture with a texture behind there, then it will still show through, and it will look, I guess, more like what a shadow would. Okay, so that's the first example of a shadow. Actually, sorry, that was actually the first two examples of a shadow. So that first style I only really meant to show you without the blurring value. So we'll do shadows 2, which is going to be essentially exactly the same, but with a blur value. And let's give it negative values, just to remind us that we can also do that. Okay, and the third example is going to be so let's take let's see. Okay, so there's one more option that we can actually add to the specification of a shadow, and that's to change from a external shadow to an internal shadow. So maybe you want to cast a shadow internally into the object itself, and so all you need to do to specify that is add the keyword inset. Okay, and it will use the same values, but it will project it into the actual object itself. And again, if you you can choose which direction it comes from simply by reversing the sign of the values that you specify there. And of course, the blurring all works the same as well. And just as one very last thing, you can actually add multiple shadows to an object, so you could have an internal and an external shadow, and all you need to do that is simply put a comma after your first shadow definition and then specify a second shadow, or the properties for a second shadow I should say. So let's add this first one back. Okay, and add some blurring, and just to show you that it doesn't have to be a grayscale shadow. Okay, we can add any color shadow with any kind of opacity that we like. Okay, so that's shadows. That will save you a lot of time in Photoshop. And the only other thing to show you to do with shadows is you can actually apply shadow to text as well, but it's a different style to apply text to shadows as it is to apply what's referred to as a box shadow to other elements. So I've got this heading 2 here with a class of text shadow. Okay, and I'll just make the font size bigger so that we can see it a bit better. Okay, so the style that we use to apply a text shadow, let's make it even bigger. The style that we used to apply text shadow is fairly obviously enough text-shadow, and this one doesn't require the prefix, and again we just give it the same type of values that we would to the box shadow. So we give it a X and Y offset and then a blur value and a color. So let's say 3 pixels right, 5 pixels down, 5 pixels of blur, and black. Okay, so there we have a text shadow there now. So again, something previously, if you wanted something like that, you'd have to forego actually having the text written in your HTML and insert that as an image. Okay. Next I want to show you some, again, essentially new ways of doing things where you previously would have had to create images, and that is creating gradient fills. Okay, so I have that back over there. Okay, so I have a bunch of my box elements again, and I'm going to apply different types of gradients as fills. So the simplest type of gradient is essentially a linear gradient, one that just goes from one color to another color. So I've got a style on this top one called linear gradient. Okay, and the way that we actually apply this is by specifying the gradient as a background image style. Okay, but the new part here is rather than specifying a URL, we specify a gradient, and we define that again using a, in this case, a WebKit prefix, and we go WebKit gradient. Okay, and the values that you give it, again, inside these parentheses here, are first of all the type of gradient, so in this case linear, and then you essentially say which part of the shape you want it to start at, which part of the shape you want it to finish at, and then which color you want it to start at and which color you want it to finish at. So this one is saying give us a linear gradient that starts from the left top and ends at the left bottom, so it goes essentially straight down, and it goes from white to black. So if we want to make this go, so we could achieve the exact same thing by going right top to right bottom. Okay, because we're only going in one direction. It doesn't matter if we're going left top to left bottom or right top to right bottom. It's still going to be straight down. But if we want to do something like go diagonally, then it is important how we specify. So if we want to go left top to right bottom, okay, then we get diagonal. If we want something to go horizontally, then we can just go left top to right top. Okay, and we get a horizontal gradient. And then, of course, here you can specify any colors that you want, including RGBA colors. So we might go from, let's say we go from RGBA 0000 to RGBA 0001. Okay, so what you can see here is I've applied a gradient which now goes from fully transparent black to fully opaque black. And what that means is I can have a solid color behind it which will actually show through. So if I were to change the background color to red, okay, you'll see it shows through because my gradient now goes from opaque to completely from completely transparent to completely opaque. And you can actually apply an image and then a gradient over the top as well. So you can still apply a background image as a URL and apply a gradient over the top of that. So you could do things like creating sort of, like gloss or gradient effects over the top of an image without having to encode those into the image themselves. Okay, so let's change that back to... Okay, there we go. So, okay, so the next type of gradient is an extension on this one, and it's called a color stop gradient. So this div I've got with a class of color stop gradient here. Okay, so color stop gradients might be useful to talk about those in terms of something like Photoshop again. So let's see if we get this. Sorry, I've got the gradient tool. Okay, there we go. So this is how you would specify a gradient in something like Photoshop. So essentially the information that you need to know about a gradient, color stop gradient, is which are the colors that go into it and in which order, and then how far between the beginning and the end do they exist. So in this case we can go, let's say it goes from red to green, and in the middle here we add another one which is blue. Okay, then you can see as I drag this one along, it changes the strength, or it changes the distribution of the colors along that color stop gradient. So the way that we specify in CSS essentially does exactly that. It says what color are they, which order are they in, and at what percentage from 0 to 100 should I put that color stop. So if I was doing it something like this, it'd be red at 0%, followed by blue at 50%, followed by green at 100%. Okay, so we do the same thing with our background image. And we go WebKit gradient, and we specify, essentially we specify a linear gradient again, except that we add extra versions of that gradient. Just expand my notes here. Okay, so let's do this one. Okay, from left top to right bottom, from green to blue. Okay, so that's okay. So this is exactly what we did in this top one, essentially specifying a normal linear gradient. So what we do is we specify the start and the end points, and then any color stops we want to add into the middle, we just add on by having a comma here, and then we say color stop, and we say, in terms of a percentage, how far along that do we want the color stop to be. So if we want it to be in the middle, we can go 0.5. And we also tell it what color we want it to be. So if we want it to be red in the middle, so there it is. So you can see as I modify this value here, if I go from 0.5 to 0.8, it pushes that red color stop further towards the end of the gradient. If I make it 0.2, it pushes it further towards the beginning of the gradient. Okay, and if you want more color stops, then you just simply repeat that process. Add another comma, color stop, and then a percentage and a color. And again, any of these colors could be RGBA colors as well. So this next one just demonstrates what I mentioned briefly before, which is having a gradient with a image behind it. So I've got this div here with a class of multiple gradient. Okay, and we'll do background image, kit gradient. Okay, we'll do gradient there again, and I'm going to do this from transparent black to opaque black again. Okay, so, and I do that because if I have an image behind here, I need there to be some opacity so that the image actually shows through. And if I want to also include an image on that, then all I do is add a URL and then the path to the image itself. So I've got the Qt logo here, which is under my images folder. So images / qt_logo.jpg. Okay, and there it is. So we've got the gradient will always be applied over the top of the image. So there we've got the image sitting by itself. If we don't have that gradient, okay, there's the image by itself. All right, and there's the gradient over the top going from transparent black to opaque black. So that's what I mean by you can add shadow effects, gloss effects, things like that now by adding these gradient overlays without having to design them into the images themselves. Which is really good for things like dynamic images. So if a user uploads, let's say you've got a site where a user uploads an image for their profile picture and you want to style everyone's profile picture in a way, then you can do that because you're not going to download everyone's profile picture and modify it in Photoshop and then upload it again. Okay, the last type of gradient I want to show you is a radial gradient. So dot radial gradient. Okay, now the radial gradient, again, we start with the background image, and again, WebKit gradient, but this time instead of specifying linear, we specify radial. Okay, and I'm just going to type these values out and then I'll explain what they actually do. So it's very important to make sure that your brackets are nested correctly when you're doing this as well. Sorry, let's just do a color for now. Okay, so Okay, so this is what a radial gradient looks like, and the way that we define a radial gradient is essentially by defining two circles. So one for the inner gradient circle and one for the outer gradient circle. And so these first three numbers here define the first circle, and the second three numbers here define the second circle. And then we say, what do we want the color of the inner circle to be, and what do we want the color of the outer circle to be. So just to take the first two of this group of three numbers, which defines the inner circle, the first two numbers specify where we want the center of the circle to be. So if I was to set this to be 0 and 0, you can see that the radial gradient, or that circle, centers itself in the top left. So the first two numbers are an x offset and a y offset of where you want the center point of that inner circle to be. So in my case, I want them both to be in the middle, so I've set them to 50% of the 50% across and 50% down. And you'll notice that I've set the outer circle with the same values, so that the two center points of the circles are in the same place. Now the third number here, for lack of a better term, defines the strength of that particular circle's gradient. So probably the only good way to demonstrate this is just to change the number and see what it does. So notice what happens when I change this inner circle's strength value from 0 to 10. So what it ends up doing is making 10 pixels worth of the inner circle's the completely saturated version of that color. If I was to set that all the way up to, well, I can't even set it that high, let's say 50, okay, you can see that it gets a lot stronger. So similarly, if we want this outer purple gradient to come in a bit more, then what we actually do is decrease what was the strength number, or what was the third number for defining it. So this is like saying how far out do we want the second circle to start. So if I reduce this down from 100 to 60, you can see that the purple comes in more. So that's how you adjust how much of each color sort of fills up the shape, by adjusting those two strength values. And then, as I said, the first two values are saying where you actually want to orient the gradient. So as I said, we could orient it anywhere we want. So you've got quite a lot of flexibility with how you define a radial gradient there as well. And you can add color stops to that in the same way that you add them to the linear gradient. Okay, how are we going with time? Pretty good. Okay, next thing we'll talk about is masking. Okay, so I'm going to show you three different kinds of masking that you can do with CSS3. We can use an image to mask something, we can use a gradient to mask something, and we can also use text to mask out an image as well. So, let's see. So this first image here, which again is of the QUT logo, what I want to do is essentially I've got a second image here called star.svg, which is just a vector image of a star. Now I could use a PNG file here as well if I want. It's just got to be some form of image that has transparency. So what I want to do is apply this star to it so that only the parts of that image that fit within the star shape actually show through. Okay, just like you'd apply a mask in any visual editing tool. So you can see if I click on this that an SVG is actually defined as a bunch of numbers in XML, but I can, if I open this in Illustrator, Okay, you can see there's my mask. So essentially, with a mask, anything that's black or opaque is going to show through what's behind it, and anything that's white or transparent is not going to show through what's behind it. So what we should see is that the QUT logo is sort of like cookie cutted out by this star shape. Okay, so my class here is star mask. Alright, and okay. So this again needs the WebKit prefix. WebKit WebKit mask image. Okay, and then all we really do is point it to where the image is that we want to use as the mask. So the URL syntax and images/star.svg. Okay, and there you can see the star mask is applying there. So it is sort of cutting it out, but you'll notice because the star is slightly smaller than the image itself, it's doing an automatic repeating thing here, which I don't really want to do. So I can avoid that by adding a style called WebKit mask position, and again I just give it two values to say where I want it to offset from the top left. So if I want to set it to be in the center, I can just say center and center. And if I want to get rid of this little kaleidoscoping effect here, then I can just tell the mask not to actually repeat, just to put the mask in there once and don't tile. So it's similar to when you add a background image. The default behavior is actually to tile that image. So we do that by going WebKit mask repeat and no repeat. Okay, and there it is. So now we have our mask, and it's centered, and it just shows through the part behind the part of the image that the mask actually contains. So as I said, you can use either a SVG image for that or a PNG image. And if you use a PNG image and you have subtle transitions between the transparency, it will take that into account as well. Okay, so next one is the you can use a gradient as a mask. Okay, so the way that we specify this is essentially the same way that we would specify a linear gradient or any kind of gradient, but the style that we use is WebKit mask gradient, I think. Sorry. We also use WebKit mask image. Okay, so we use the same, but instead of pointing to an image, we define a gradient. So let's say in this one, here, what I'm going to do is create like a feathered circle frame around this image. So I can do that by specifying a radial gradient with, let's see, I figured this out earlier. Okay, we'll go 2 circles at 50%, 50%. First one, strength 40, 50%, 15. Okay, so this one for if you're going to use a gradient as a mask, then all it really cares about is the transparency. So it doesn't matter what color that you make it, just what the transparency value is. So we'll go from, let's go from RGBA 0001, so that's fully opaque black, to RGBA 0000. Okay, so if this if I change this to background image, maybe it doesn't like that. Okay, so if that was just a normal gradient, what you would see is a gradient where the inner circle is black and then it fades out to just transparent. So using that, it's saying, okay, whichever part of it is black, just show through what's behind the image there, and whichever part is transparent, don't show through. So you can see the fact that it fades from opaque to transparent, that you actually get this feathering here. And so I can adjust the strength values of my two circles to either exaggerate or make that less of a case. Okay, so that's using a gradient mask. So that's a radial gradient there, but you can use a linear gradient as well. Okay, and the last type of mask down here is using text as a mask. So what I actually want to do is have an image where I use the text to just don't show through the image where the text happens to be. So we've got .text mask, and we'll just make this text a bit bigger. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is, so this is essentially just text inside of a div. So there's my div, and I've just got the word text there. So what I want to do is add an image as a background image to the div that contains this text. So I've got this image here, bristle grass, which I'm going to use. Okay, and so that appears as a background image for the div itself. So we've got a little bit to adjust with that, so it looks right, but I'll ignore that for now. The thing that actually does the masking is a style called WebKit background clip. Okay, and we can tell it what to clip to, and in this case we want it to clip to the text. Okay, and all it looks like it's done now is just disappeared the background image, but it's actually worked. But the reason that we can't see the image behind the text is because the text still has a default color of black applied to it, which is overlaying the image. So all we need to do is set the color value of the text to be transparent. As long as I can spell. Okay, and there you can see that the image now shows up behind the text. Now, I did say there'd be a little bit of a problem because you might not be able to notice it a lot, but as I'm dragging this across, the background image is actually moving because the size of the div that contains it is being made bigger and smaller. So if we want that if we want that background image always to stay in the same place, I mean, that may be an effect that you want, but if you want it always to stay in the same place, then we just need to do two things. And I'll get rid of these two styles first, just to show you a bit more obviously what it's doing. So, as you know, by default, a div is a block level element, which means it takes up all of the horizontal space available to it. So that's why when I'm resizing this, the div gets wider and smaller. If I don't want it to do that, I just set the style of the div to display inline. Okay, and now the div only takes up as much space as the contents require. So the other thing I'll do is, because a lot of this image is missing because it's quite a large image, what I'm going to do is this is another new CSS3 style called background size. Okay, and I can set it to be 100% of the width and 100% of the height. Okay, and now when I add my clipping style back in and set the text to transparent, now it doesn't matter how much I resize this. Okay, it's not going to slide around the image behind it. Incidentally, this background size style here now makes it a lot easier to have a background image that actually resizes to the size of the browser window. So I can, for example, on the body element, set a background image, and let's use this pink forest one. .jpg. Okay, there we go. So again, the default way that a background image is going to display is to tile itself. And previously, if you wanted to make a background image that resizes with the window, you'd have to put an image element in and set it to 100% of the width, and then have layers over the top of that and all sorts of other nonsense, or do something with JavaScript. In this way, all you have to do is say, again, use this background size, and you can just say 100%. Okay, and depending on whether you want it to size proportionally or not, you could have it stretch in both directions with 100% width and 100% height. Okay, and then it will always take up that percentage of the element no matter what size the window is. Okay, so that's just a little aside. I'll remove that because it's a little distracting. Okay. When we get to text masks. Okay, so now we're going to do some other effects which get a little bit more fancy, I guess you could say. Okay, so next thing I'm going to demonstrate is you can have reflections for any element. So again, I've got the QUT logo here, and I've given the image a class of reflection. Okay, so with reflection, again, you need the browser-specific prefix. So we're going to have WebKit box reflect. Okay, and you can give this varying amounts of detail. The first thing you specify is what direction you want it to reflect. So normally you'll go below, but you can also have above. left, and right. Okay, but probably usually you're just going to have it go below, so we'll do that one. So as you can see, it's essentially like how you would create a reflection for an element in Photoshop. You simply just flip it vertically so it looks like a mirror image. Now, other things that you probably normally do when you create a reflection, though, is create some kind of offset. So we can put in a value here. So let's say 4 pixels, and that will give you the offset between the image and the reflection itself. So you can adjust how high or how far away the object appears to be from its reflected surface. And the last thing that you can do with this, which you probably want to do, is add some sort of gradient so it fades out. So it's not very often that you have a perfectly reflective surface that reflects it exactly. So normally when you see this kind of effect, it'll be sort of faded out. So what we can do is apply any kind of mask to that reflection. So for example, we can apply a gradient. WebKit gradient. We'll go linear from left top to left bottom, from transparent to what have I got here? Okay, I got something wrong here. Let me just check. Yeah, that'll be it. Perfect, thanks. So this is a normal definition of a linear gradient, as we've done before. But a couple of things to note is that you'll notice that I've said it goes from left top to left bottom here. But actually, if you take it from the point of view of the reflection, it looks like it goes the other way. So you've got to define it actually from the original object, not the reflected one. But that's easy enough just to swap the colors around if you run into that. And then the other thing you'll notice is that the reflection doesn't actually take up any of the space within the flow of elements. So if we want to push the rest of this stuff down, then we have to add some margin below this. Okay, and I can estimate the amount of margin that I'll need because I know that that image is 100 pixels tall, and then there's a 4 pixel gap, or that 4 pixel offset. So if I set it to be about 104 pixels margin, okay, then it'll comfortably fit there. Okay, so that's reflections. Okay, so the next one is... Alright, so we just got a handful more to go. So next thing is going to be transformations. Okay, so I'm just going to add some styles again to make these appear side by side. Okay, so all right, I've got a list of 3 images that are again the QT logo, and I'm going to apply different transformations to these. And then I've got just this text in here as well to show you that it works on any element, not just images. So alright, so what will we do first? Let's go okay, so I've got these in a div called with an ID of pictures, and let's say I'll use the nth child pseudo selector again to specify which one of these I want to which target. So I can say li nth child 1. Okay, and I'll apply a transformation to this one. So we can apply the different transformations we can apply are mental blank. Panning, so moving something left and right, rotating, and scaling. Okay, so they're the 3 transformations we can apply, and we can do those in both 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional space. So the way that we do that is to go WebKit transform, and as far as I'm aware, the WebKit browser is the only one so far that supports these transforms as well. So hopefully other browsers will be adding them kind of soon. Okay, so we can go rotate, and then we give it a certain number of degrees. So if I go 45 DEG, okay, you can see that my first list item, that's the first child, is rotated 45 degrees. You can also give that a negative value to go the other way. We can go let's get this second one to go translate. That's the one I was trying to think of. Okay, so translate is what I meant when I said goes left and goes left, right, up and down. So we can translate by a certain number of pixels, I think, which is really the same as giving something a relative position and then an offset. It essentially achieves the exact same effect. So you can push that left and right, for example. We can also scale. Okay, so we scale and we give it a number between 0, which means it has no scale, so it obviously disappears. 1 is 100%. We can increase the scale by giving it multiples and any kind of fraction. So if we want it to be half of its original size, 0.5. And let's see what else. We can actually chain these transformations together, so we could both rotate and scale. Okay, so that's rotating at 60 degrees and then scaling it by 50%. And then we could also translate by 20 pixels and 10 pixels. Oops. Just 20 pixels. So now the important thing to remember though when you're chaining transformations together is that the order that you specify them can make a difference. So if you rotate something and then translate it, it's going to look different to if you translate it and then rotate it. Okay, now what else? Okay, just on that, let me just add a new style here to the third one, and let's just say rotate Okay, now just talking about rotation, which I'll put on this third one here. Okay, so this one rotating 60 degrees. By default, it rotates around a origin which is at the center of the object. Now you can tell it to rotate around a different point. So let's say you don't want it to rotate around the center, but you'd rather have it pivot around this corner here. So the way that we can do that is to use the WebKit transform origin. Okay, and we again give it an offset from the top left. So if I want it to be the bottom right, then I say 100% across and 100% down. Okay, so now it's pivoting 45 degrees, but it's pivoting as if it was rotating around its bottom right corner as opposed to the center of the object. Okay, let's go back up to this first one and let's get rid of that transformation. And I did say that you can rotate both two-dimensionally and three-dimensionally. So in three dimensions you have three axes. You have the x-axis, the y-axis, and the z-axis. So in terms of applying these transformations, you've got to imagine that the x-axis is left and right across the screen. The y-axis is up and down across the screen, and then the z-axis is coming out from the screen. So all of our 2D transformations have actually been 3D transformations, but around the z-axis. So if we're rotating around the z-axis, then it just looks like it's been rotating around in a flat plane. So there is no actual rotate z, because that's the default rotation, but we can rotate around the other two axes, the x and the y axis, by just going rotate x, for example. Okay, and so what that's done is rotated that plane towards me by 45 degrees. So what it looks like is it's sort of falling over on me. And if we rotate y, okay, then it's rotated around away from me that way. Now, because there's no perspective applied to this, it doesn't look particularly three-dimensional. So normally to make something look three-dimensional, you have to have perspective so that all of those lines aren't equal, because that doesn't look any different to it as if we just squished the image. So we can actually apply perspective to this, and the way that we do that is we apply the perspective setting to an element that's above what we've done the rotations on. So what I want to actually do is, because I've got the rotations on these elements here, I either want to put the perspective setting on the unordered list or on the pictures div itself. So I'll do that. I'll select the pictures div, and notice the difference that this 3D transformation makes when I set WebKit perspective, and you essentially give this a number, and the smaller the number, okay, the more extreme the perspective is, and the larger the number, the less extreme it is. So if I set that to 500, now you can see that it rotates, but it looks a lot more realistically three-dimensional because it skews it as it rotates based on the perspective setting. So the other thing with that is we can actually have multiple transformations. So I could, for example, transform this entire unordered list. So I can go pictures, UL, and WebKit transform rotate Y. Okay, so what I've done now is I've rotated that entire unordered list that contains the images, or the list items and the images So it's also rotating 45 degrees around the y-axis. Now you may have picked up on a funny thing whereby I had already rotated this QUT logo by 45 degrees, and so if I'm to rotate its parent object by 45 degrees also, then it should actually rotate a full 90 degrees and be pointing the wrong way. So you can see that it doesn't actually change that, and that's a little bit of a weird default behavior with this, that similar three-dimensional transformations don't get added upon as you go down the chain by default. But you can fix that by, in the same place here, using the WebKit transform. Oops. What am I looking for? Transform style. Okay, and we can give this a value of preserve 3D. Okay, and now it does actually combine those two rotations. Okay, so I mean, you can mess around with transformations all you want. There's lots of stuff you can do with them, but that kind of covers the basics. Okay, so we've just got two more topics left to cover. And so we've looked at a whole bunch of ways that we can change the appearance of things, but the other thing that CSS3 allows us to do is actually to animate things. So again, something which if you wanted to do previously, you would have had to create an animated GIF or embed a Flash movie or do some complex JavaScript. So we can actually create some simple animations in CSS3 now. Alright, let's go transitions. Okay, so again, I've got my box with the QUT logo in it, and what I want to do is create a transition between what I'm going to do is simulate a hover state, but instead of just having two static states, I want to transition smoothly between those two things. So what I'm going to do is got a class called .transition here for my image, and I'm going to give it a WebKit transform. And let's go rotate X minus 30 degrees and scale 1.2. Okay, so again, it doesn't look very nice because I haven't applied any perspective, so what I'm going to do is set a perspective setting to the div immediately above that, which is the div with the ID of transitions plural. Okay, and we'll go WebKit perspective 150. Okay, now this is a good point to mention. One other thing about the WebKit perspective is you'll notice that it's sort of weird that the vanishing point appears to be over here somewhere rather than in the middle. And so the reason for that is, again, because my div is resizing, then the origin of the perspective actually happens to be in the middle of the div. So you'll notice again, as the div gets bigger and smaller, the look of the perspective actually changes. Now again, that might be a cool effect that you want to have, but for me, I'd rather have the origin point be in the middle of my image, because all I want it to do is look like it's tilting forward and tilting back. So again, the way I'm going to get around this is to make my div have a display of inline. So it's only as wide as the image itself that it contains. And okay, I think that's all I need to do for that, actually. Actually, I'll do something else. So that I have some room around the left-hand side here, what I might just do is set the text align to center. Okay, and then my image will actually sit in the middle of my div, and I've still got some space either side of it to expand, so that's probably a little better. Okay. Now, what I want to do is get this transition going, and I want it to actually apply when I hover over the image. So I'm going to add the pseudo class hover to this transition style. Okay, so that, and this hover selector is something that's been in CSS2, so this is nothing new, but it's the transform CSS3 style which we can actually apply to it. So as you can see, what you can have there is you can have all these new kind of rollover effects that do different things without having to use image replacement techniques. Now that's not even yet a smooth transition, so what I want it to actually do is to, almost like in Flash, you tween between those two states. So what I can do is say WebKit transition. Okay, so when I specify a WebKit transition, I tell it one of three things. I say what property I want to transition, I tell it how long I want the transition to take, and I tell it what kind of easing function I want it to use. So usually you will say I just want to transition all of the styles that this has. So we set all for the first one. And then we'll say let's make it last 500 milliseconds, or let's make it 1,000. Let's make it last a second just so we can see it a bit easier. And I'll apply. So you've got various options for easing. You've got ease in, ease out, and ease in, out, which you should be familiar with if you've done any kind of animation. Okay, so you can see now when I hover over it, it doesn't immediately snap to the new style. What it does is it transitions between its default style and the new style. Okay, and you can transition pretty much any CSS property that you want. So we could apply a, let's just say we have in the default transition state, we have an opacity of 0.5, and on the hover state we have a opacity of 1. So when we hover, we both want it to transition the WebKit transform, but also the opacity. So this is where it's handy, where we're specifying transition all, then I don't have to say, well, transition the rotation and transition the opacity. Okay, so now when I hover over, okay, it transitions all of those effects. Now there's one more thing I want to do, because it transitions in nicely, but when I hover out it just snaps back to the original state. So what I can do is set the WebKit transition on the default state to essentially be the same thing. Okay, so now when I hover out, it transitions nicely back like that. Okay, and again, that's really efficient in terms of the assets that we have to store, because we're not storing keyframes, we're not storing a whole bunch of code. All we're storing is a CSS directive to say transition your styles from this state to another state. You could change the images, but in terms of transitioning between the two, what I'd say you'd have to do is have both images overlaid and transition the opacity of one out and the other one in. Yeah. Okay. Okay, very quickly, I've just got two more things to go through. Nearly done. Okay, this one's quite a bit of typing, so I might just paste this one in and then just kind of tell you what it does. This is just an extension on the transitions, which allows you to add keyframes to your animations, so you can have even more control. You can have, kind of like with color stops with the gradients, you don't just have a start and an end point, but you can specify other keyframes in between to also include as part of the animation. So I'll just copy the completed style for this over. Okay, so there's a couple of new things in here. The first is something that it's an entirely new type of CSS syntax, and that's defining a CSS variable. So you can define variables now which you refer to later on. So the way that we specify keyframes is to define a WebKit keyframes variable, and then we give it a name. I've just called it my animation. And what you do is you specify, again, like when we were specifying the color stops in a gradient, you use percentages to say this far through the animation I want these styles to apply. So what I'm doing here is at 0%, which is at the very start of the animation. Then I have the border radius set to 0, so I have sharp corners. By the very end, I set the border radius to be 20 pixels and change the background color to be orange. And then in the middle, I want it to transition halfway through so that the background color is blue. And so then what I do is down here where I want to trigger the animation, which is again in a hover event, I use the WebKit animation syntax here, and I refer to what I named my animation up here, so my animation. So I could define multiple different keyframe animations, and then again it's just the duration and then the easing function that you want to use. Okay, and so it ends up looking like this. Okay, so you can see that it goes through all those keyframes. I've only got it doing it in forward, so when I hover out it jumps straight back, but you can see that it goes, so there's two things that it's transitioning at different points: the background color, which goes from red to blue to orange, okay, and then the rounded corners, which go from 0% to 20 pixels. Okay, so that's keyframe animation. And the last thing is some of the new typography things that you can do. And I know some people have already been looking into the CSS font faces, but I'll go over it anyway. So okay, so I've got a bunch of text here, and the first thing we'll look at is so let me just style this up a little bit. Okay, so I've just given it a background gradient and a border to make it look a bit nicer, a bit easier to read. The first thing I want to show you is, and this is something, again, which you might have already looked at, but you can now add columns to text. So the way that we do that is you have the text within a container, and then you specify the number of columns for that container to have. So as you can see down here, I've got my first paragraph, and then I've got the second two paragraphs wrapped within a div with a class of columns. So what I do is I say my columns class, And in this case, I think now you don't actually need the browser specific prefix, so we might. No, actually, I think we still do. I remember trying that last night. WebKit column count. Okay, and you just give the WebKit column count a certain number, as many or as few as you like. Okay, and it will automatically format your content into columns. So that's a lot nicer than having to split up your content into divs and then lay them out like that. Couple of other things that you can add to this is you can modify the WebKit column gap. Okay, and just give it a certain number of pixels and it will modify how much space there is between the columns. And you can also specify a WebKit column rule, which is essentially the same way that you would define a border. Okay, so you could say 1 pixel dash, a bit darker. Okay, so you can actually have rules between the columns, and there's a bunch of other stuff you can do with columns, which you can easily look into on something like W3 Schools. The other thing you can do, and again, just to save a bit of time, I'll copy and paste this one. Okay, the other thing you can do is, and this is really just another use of the new CSS3 pseudo classes. So you can create things like drop caps. So the way I've done that here is through this style here, where I say, okay, my typography div, get all of the paragraphs directly underneath the typography div, and I've actually chained 2 pseudo selectors here. So I say, get the first of type paragraph and then get the first letter of that. So it selects the first paragraph and then the first letter, and then it applies just a style which makes that particular character larger and then sets the text indent and floating so it appears like a drop cap. Okay, very last thing is custom fonts. So as you're probably aware, when you're specifying a font family in CSS, for the font to display, it's actually required that the font is on the computer of the person who's viewing it. So if you specify a uncommon font that might be on your computer, then when someone else goes and view it, it's going to default back to some other font. Now CSS3, we actually finally, long overdue, get the ability to embed fonts in the web server and then load them, so you don't have to rely on the user's computer actually having the font in order to display it. So the way that we do that is still a little bit convoluted, mainly because the different browsers have all decided that they want to use different font file formats for their own browsers. So what I would do is direct you to a website called Font Squirrel. This is a really good website for it gives you both font for any of these fonts. You can download a package containing all of the font file formats that you'll need to run across all the browsers, and it will also generate the CSS code for you. You've also got the option here of, if you have a font file on your computer, you can upload it and it will convert it to all of the other font files that you might need. Now I've already done this, so you can see, where are we? Okay, so here's my fonts folder, and you'll notice that I've got 4 different font file formats. And they all work in different browsers. So again, for it to work across all of the possible browsers that support embedded fonts, then we need to include all of these and specify each one in a style. So the The CSS is a little verbose just because we have to refer to all of those font files. So again, I'll just copy and paste that. Okay, but again, this is another example of using the at symbol in CSS to define a CSS variable. So for each font that you want to include, you need to specify one of these, a font face declaration. And within that font face declaration, we give it a name. And here you can call it whatever you want. It makes sense to call it the same name as the font. But that's what you refer to it when you're applying it to a particular element anywhere else in the CSS. And then what you have here is a bunch of source attributes. And the first one, you'll notice that you repeat this twice. All of them except the first one you can put in as commas. And the only reason you have to do it like this is because Internet Explorer will freak out if you try and give it a list. So this first one is the Internet Explorer format, and then the second list is all of the other formats. So this is the code that something like Font Squirrel will generate for you. But essentially you're just declaring a URL to wherever they are. So this needs to be relative to where your CSS actually is. So in my case it's in fonts and then / the file name. And each of these, other than the Internet Explorer version, you also specify a format which you can find documentation on this. And you actually specify a name like this, like embedded open type, WFF, true type, and SVG. And then down here, this is where you specify, because you might actually need multiple versions of a font to display it in regular and bold and italic. So this is where you specify which type of font weight and which type of font style this custom font should apply to. And then once we've defined that font face, then simply all you need to do is declare it like you would any other font. So using the name that we've defined up here for the font family, and I can define it in a list with other non-embedded fonts as well. So I can include fallback fonts. Okay, if the browser doesn't support embedded fonts. Okay, and you can see here now that's where my custom font is applied. You can see if I get rid of that, where it reverts back to the default font. And there it is. And just to prove to you that it is actual text, okay, I can select that and copy it and paste it just like I would any other text. Okay, so obviously that's a huge benefit, because if you've ever done custom font stuff before, you'll either have had to do it as an image, and anytime the text needs to be edited, you have to re-edit the image, or there's had to be some convoluted JavaScript workaround where it does image replacements for the individual characters. So now it's a lot easier to add sort of more interesting typography to your website and be sure that it's going to be a consistent experience across different browsers and different users.